Welcome everyone to the round table for this afternoon, where we want to talk about the impact of the COVID crisis and also other crises on democratic societies. In the various panels we've had during the symposium today, and that we're going to have tomorrow, we already talked and addressed a number of economic and social costs that the pandemic has brought with it, and that it's going to bring with it. But the question is also, to what extent does democracy threaten or maybe just challenge our democracies? And that's what we want to talk today. I think an immediate impact regarding democracy was apparent quite soon. Emergency situations mean almost by definition that decisions have to be made under an enormous time pressure, and also in situations of uncertainty. And this was certainly the case with the pandemic. And so for democratic systems that rely on accountability and legitimacy, that is, of course, a particular challenge, and especially so if the crisis creates a situation that the institutions that guarantee accountability and legitimacy, namely our parliaments, suddenly find it difficult to meet. So during the early stages of a crisis, and that's nothing that is very unusual, we've seen parliamentary involvement was relatively constrained. Emergencies or crises are characterized by fast-track legislation, very often by a cross-party consensus. So parliamentary scrutiny is limited and party politics take more of a backseat. What we also see, and we saw this in this crisis in particular, is a so-called, and by now I think famous, rally around the flag effect. So in most European countries we have seen the support rates and the public approval for governments increase quite dramatically, even soar. And we did see that quite irrespective of the particular party or parties in government, and we saw that quite irrespective of the particular measures that the governments chose to combat the crisis and the virus. At the same time, we also see that governments can and did, to various degrees, and we'll talk about that, benefit strategically from such emergency situations. And in this case, coupling the very, very real threat emanating from the virus with a very strategic fear scenario also enabled governments to use that as an effective means to push through necessary and sometimes maybe not so necessary and very far-reaching emergency measures. We will talk about that. So now that lockdowns are being lifted and we're returning to normal, or should we say a new normal maybe that we need to get used to, I think it's also a very good time to reflect on how resilient our democratic societies are when it comes to such viruses and crises. What are the structural problems that the pandemic has laid bare? How do we address them, both nationally and also within the EU? So that's the kind of questions that we want to talk about today. And I am immensely happy to introduce our excellent two guests to you. We have, on the one hand, Judy Kolenberger, and we have Ben Crom. Two excellent guests. Judy Kolenberger is a postdoctoral researcher at the Vienna University of Economics and Business, and her main field of research, and you will see that this is incredibly relevant to the discussion, is migration, especially forced migration, as well as integration. And something I find very interesting, she currently heads a large research project on inclusion, participation and enablement of refugee women in Austria. So welcome, Judith, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
And on the other hand, we have Ben Crom, who is a professor at the Free University in Amsterdam and works on democracy in the EU, as well as on the impact of European integration on democratic structures and practices within the member states, and also in particular on a topic that is very close to my heart as well, namely the role of national parliaments in EU affairs, on the role of interparliamentary cooperation. And he is also working on a research project that is very relevant, I think, for the discussion today. He's one of the leaders of a Horizon 2020 project that deals with reconciling Europe with its citizens through democracy and rule of law. So again, Ben, so glad to have you. Welcome. I think we should maybe give each of you the opportunity to sort of give your views in a statement of maybe, I don't know, we're a small round table, so we can take our time of about, I don't know, 8 minutes, and maybe we'll go in alphabetical order. So Ben, if you would like to start.
Okay, thank you for this opportunity to talk about these things, and they are still moving, of course, so it's always risky to make any claims about what's going on and where it may be heading. And I guess we're all a bit tired of the crisis. We want to have our holidays and we want to get our normal lives back. My comments, and we also want our democracy back. And rightly, you pointed out, of course, that a lot of the initial responses were governed by emergency measures and that the parliament were sidelined. But at the same time, and also that's risky to say, I would say that European democracy, and I will be talking about Europe, and about also the relationship between Europe as a whole and individual member states, that Europe as a whole seems to have done, under the circumstances, not that badly. And I want to highlight two things here. I mean, one is indeed that even if it wasn't maybe driven by democratic sentiment by the people, I think what's striking is that we had a diverse array of responses. There were many different responses, and in a way that shows also kind of responsiveness. So that the responses were fine-tuned to the situations at hand and the people at hand. So what we see is indeed that, of course, there was a strong response in Italy, in Spain, and that other countries took a more, say, relaxed or laid-back response. That a lot of the communication, as you highlighted, went to the national capitals, so that prime ministers or presidents played a very prominent role in communicating with the citizens what kind of measures they did impose, why they imposed it, and what it required from the citizens in response. And I think this pattern that there was this. You can say, of course, that's a weakness of Europe, that there's no coherent response, that Brussels does not steer it from the top down and we impose a coherent response. But exactly, I think this loose response, where countries look at each other, respond to each other, learn from each other, may be criticized by each other, that citizens will say, hey, but they're doing it differently in Sweden, or they're doing it differently in Germany. I think that's a very striking situation. And I think what's striking here is also, of course, that this was a truly transnational global response, not in the sense that it hit the world in one way, but that we all responded across the world, and we saw it moving in real time, so that we know that things were happening in China, we know that things are happening in Brazil, and we observe how the virus travels around the world. But what I basically want to argue here is that the kind of networked response that we saw in Europe, rather than saying that it was a weakness, that there was no central direction of masks or of respiratory technology, that actually this networked response has maybe enabled Europe to respond relatively well, without downplaying, of course, the casualties that have taken place. But I think on the whole, Europe can at this moment say that it has responded quite well to the challenges. And I also think that says something about what Europe is. It's a networked, it's a rather horizontal construct. It's not something that necessarily has to be run top down and from Brussels. And I think when you also talk about a lot of this, will also be about telling the story, what has happened here, and who has benefited and which mistakes have been made, I think European leaders can have the confidence to say, well, of course, we have not been able to act perfectly. We have not been able to preempt the virus. There have been many deaths. But under the circumstances, it could have been much worse. And I think there are plenty of examples around to refer to say that it could have been worse. So one of the big things is whether in the end we look back on this period and say it was a major mistake or response have been relatively adequate. And I think Europe can claim that it could have done much worse. Now, moving forward, of course, then you look at where do we stand and what are the main challenges that we face now and how can we move forward. And I want to first make a comment a bit about the economic debate, because I think there's something to be learned from this networked approach when you talk about what are the economic challenges, and then I want to move to the political domain and to indeed restoring and even strengthening European democracy. And in economic terms, I think a lot of the debate has now been actually on a very centralized approach. How much money can we make available at the center? How big should the recovery fund be? How much can we transfer from one country from some countries to the other? And I think we really have to think about this a bit more about how do we make our local economies work. So we have to approach this more in a bottom-up way, and it should not hinge on how much money we move around Europe, or even I think how much money we can create at the European level. It's very much about how do we make local economies work. And if you look at it from that perspective, a much more network perspective again, then I think the questions are quite different. It's not about how much money can we pledge at the European level. It's about how can we maintain economic demand, how we can make sure that people keep spending and have the money to spend. In that sense, it's very striking, I think, and a very interesting development that the Spanish government has moved to some kind of basic income arrangements. That's a sure way to make sure that people keep spending, that they have income, and that the money is there on the ground. And of course, Europe can help that, not maybe not necessarily by moving money in, but by indeed, well, some scheme of reinsurance, and that has been discussed at the European level. Not so much creating a European-wide insurance scheme, but rather a reinsurance scheme that helps countries where you see a sudden spike in unemployment, for instance, after a crisis, where you help them to deal with that crisis. So that's one way to think of it. The other one, I think that's very critical at this point at the individual level, but also at the state level, is that you can of course give money to states at this point to help them get through the crisis. But I think a big source of asymmetries that we have in Europe is debt. And of course, we know that the most vulnerable countries in Europe, particularly Italy and Greece, suffer from a large pile of debt. And rather than creating loan schemes for them, I think a more structural approach would be indeed to think about some kind of debt cancellation scheme. Anyway, that's the economics. I wanted to mention it because I think it's probably the most urgent, substantial policy challenge. But let me move to the domain that I know much more about, and that's politics. Now, you already mentioned, of course, that democracy has been suspended, and that there have been examples of countries that have used the crisis to kind of push down on democracy. And we can simply identify it. I mean, the one big example that we have in Europe is, of course, Hungary. Again and again and again and again. And it's crisis, so we let it happen again and again and again. The other, of course, case of concern has been Poland. And there, of course, the initial initiative was very much to try to push the presidential elections to take place in May still. Unfortunately, by a combination of forces, in the end, at the last moment, in a way, the government was forced to reconsider that, and they had elections, or the first round of presidential elections, just 2 days ago on Sunday. And it's going to be a tight race. We have 2 candidates left standing, and for Europe, it will be it's not just a major question, I think, for Europe, for Poland, and for the future of Polish democracy, where the President Duda gets another term. But it's also a major issue and a major question, and there's a big European stake involved here. If indeed President Tsarkovsky, or the candidate Tsarkovsky, gets the majority, then we have a whole different Polish political constellation. And of course, also in terms of thinking about sanctioning Hungary, it would help a lot, of course, since we need unanimity among all the member states, except for a country involved, to impose sanctions. It would help a lot if there would be a new president to break the tandem of Hungary and Poland kind of sheltering each other from sanctions for violating democracy. But I think on the whole, so far, I would say that democracy has been suspended in most of the other member states, but not forced down. And I'm quite confident that it will bounce back. And one of the big questions, indeed, is which political actors will mobilize on the political experience of the lockdown. And while some may have anticipated that the populists would do quite well and democratic forces might do quite well, I think for now the democratic forces may be reinforced. And one of the interesting things is I think that the left may benefit here, so that we may have more choices between indeed the conservative right that has been predominant in most European countries in the last 5-10 years. But there's now, I think, a very strong argument to be made about a more active state. And in that sense, we may have a more interesting political fight between the right and the left. And I think I've said enough for now. The next level, of course, the next point on the agenda here is still the conference on the future of Europe. That's still in the works. It also has its preparation has been suspended, but the Council of Ministers just adopted a position on that last week. They're going to start with it once it looks startable, that they can have a real conference, and it will not be early spring, early autumn, but later on, if we're lucky, still before the end of the year. And there's a lot to be said about that, but maybe I first shut up and see where we take it from here.
I already have a host of questions. But before we come to the discussion, Judith, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to pick up where sort of Ben left off, because I think that if we want to talk about Europe's response to COVID-19, we have to talk about borders, actually. And this is a discussion that, in my opinion, has very much been missing in a lot of media and political discourses so far. Because on the one hand, I think very much from the start of the pandemic, it was really a crisis of mobility, because the spread of the virus is, of course, connected to global human mobility, even more so than previous pandemics that we've seen, because our mobility has been accelerated, especially in the global north, of course. And so one of the first responses was to restrict mobility, to draw up borders, to instigate travel bans, and so on. And what is interesting to see here when we look at other crises, because we also said, you know, this in this roundtable, we want to see, can we actually keep several crisis situations in mind, or have we this sort of single issue approach that this is the most pressing one and then the others become less important? But if I think back, and not even far back in history, but only two of the most recent crises, I'm thinking back to 9/11, which was very much connected to borders, because after 2001, we've seen many travel bans instigated, and a similar response was the case in 2015 with the European refugee crisis. Now, it's interesting to see from a policy point of view that so far, not all of these travel bans have already been lifted. So we are still dealing with some of the measures that were introduced in 2001 and in 2015, respectively. And so this also means that I think we have to be very vigilant when it comes to, at some point or another, moving out of the crisis situation that is COVID, and then getting back our right to mobility. And because what I think the crisis also revealed is having the possibility to access your right to mobility leads to many other rights that depend on it, like the right to work, the right to education, the right to family life. So all these core democratic features really that we enjoy in Europe very often depend on being mobile, at least to a certain extent. And I think what we already see now in many of the countries that are moving sort of into this second phase of the lockdown, slowly easing out of the lockdown, like Austria is a good example, Germany is a good example, We see that mobility is slightly again made possible again, but mobility now more than before COVID emerges as a privilege. So there are certain groups of people who can travel again, tourists, prime example, people from neighboring countries, again, mobility being very much connected to resources and of course in the end to power inequalities. And then there is another group of people, and they are already in Europe, let's not forget that, refugees and asylum seekers who have been stuck in Moria and in other Greek islands from the very start of the pandemic and who still can't move. Whereas from a pure medical point of view, there is no real reason why one group of people should be able to move freely with or without tests, and the other can't even be tested to be let into the country. So I think these inequalities, they have been exacerbated, as many global inequalities have been by the pandemic. And because we said that maybe we will then also later talk about the role of social sciences, but just as a sort of a little idea here, I think that the role of social sciences should also be to remain very alert and critical of what is happening to human rights in general, but especially also the right to mobility, I would say. And connected to this, and this also brings me to the idea of democracy, is another aspect that has been very prevalent in my field of research, people doing migration studies. What has emerged in most countries that dealt with the pandemic in one way or another is that many frontline and essential workers were migrants. This was the case in Austria, this was the case in Germany, in many European countries, but also in the US. And now these basically, or I think this was part of the discourse, really, these people were called the heroes of our everyday life. They are fulfilling a citizen's duty in the largest sense. However, if you look closely, they don't have any of the citizens' rights because they don't have citizenship. And also, when we talk about democratic societies in times of crisis, this is a group of people, a growing group of people who can't participate in democracies because typically they don't have the right to vote in the country they are living in and a country that they were serving very well during the crisis. And I don't want to sound too emotional here, but they were part of them were risking their lives, right? We had all these war metaphors being very predominant, especially in France. And those were people on the front lines, I would say. And it's interesting to see that so far there has been no discussion on what does that mean for democratic participation, especially now that countries like Austria increasingly stress this idea of self-responsibility, self-reliance. Now it's up to you to take care of your own health and safety, but also of others' health and safety. So yes, this is about citizens' responsibilities and duties during a time of crisis, but it should also be connected to rights. And here minorities' rights, I think, rights of marginalized groups are very important because, and this brings me to my last point, I think that we are now in a moment where we see that maybe the crucial factor is not necessarily mobility and the fact that we are globally so connected. Yes, that is one factor, how the virus spread rapidly. But what we see now is that it's very important to keep socioeconomic circumstances in mind and keep structures of inequality and exploitation in mind, because the places where the largest infection clusters really happen are among marginalized people with precarious work situations, the meatpacking factories in the US that were already a problem way before COVID, meatpacking factories also in Germany and in other places. So where workers' rights are not being taken care of, where people are marginalized and often don't have the option for legal aid and not even healthcare, of course. This is where I think a new sort of risk group emerges. We talked about the risk group of elderly people above the age of 65. That's, I think, a biological definition of being at the risk for COVID. But there is also the social risk group. It's people who are marginalized and who don't have access to healthcare, among other things. And I think these issues slowly start to emerge. We get to see a sort of a clearer picture here. And what I would hope a learning could be when it comes to democracy, to democratic participation and so on, is to really have a hard look at existing inequalities and see how these affect everyone negatively. So even those at the top of the social hierarchy cannot move freely now and can't enjoy a healthy life and a healthy planet because the virus still exists, and it exists still because many people don't have access to healthcare, for instance. And so this means that the situation drags on. And I think the situation, if there can be any good outcome of it or learning of it, should be how connected we all are and how we benefit from also increasing equality in our societies and abolishing existing marginalization structures. So that, I think, should be hopefully one of the key learnings of this pandemic.
Thank you. Am I back? I don't seem to be back, but I'll just talk anyway. Now I'm back. Thank you very much, Judith, and both of your intervention just made me throw out my whole concept for what I wanted to how I wanted to guide the questions. And before I go on, I also want to invite all of the viewers, listeners online to post their questions in chat. I can see them and I will then address them to either Ben or Judith for you. Please also, if you can, indicate whom you want to put the question to, or if it is for both. So it would be great to have your questions. This was a question I originally had just for Ben, but I think given your really interesting statement, Judith, I think this fits for both of you so well. And Ben, I hope you'll allow me to quote your own words at you. Because in a recent contribution on how can we save our liberal democracies from the crisis, from the pandemic, you distinguish between two possible, at the time, it was a very early contribution, and you distinguish between two possible trends that, might unleash, as you called it. And allow me to quote this back at you, your own words. The first trend builds on social trust and the sense that we will need each other to get out of this crisis. It appeals to social solidarity, a sense of moderation, and increased allegiance to the public good and government action. The opposing trend, builds on social panic and personal insecurity. It seeks to externalize doubt and responsibility by calling for comprehensive action and by seeking to blame the crisis on external, but maybe also internal forces and actors. Obviously, this latter trend is inimical to democracy and the open society, while the former may actually fuel an increased allegiance to democracy, not unlike what we saw in the post-war decades. Very, very nicely put. So, weeks later, my question to you both, which of the two trends do you, in your respective fields, see as dominant? Is one trend dominant over the other? Is maybe one trend dominant at a certain level, while we see another unleashing, as you put it, at a different level? I'd be very interested in your thoughts on this. Whoever wants to go ahead, we're very informal. So Judith, why don't you start this time?
Okay, thank you. This is a really good question and a really fabulous quote, Ben, I have to say. I think that there was sort of what I mean, this is coming very much from a national perspective, I think, because we are all probably most familiar with the discourses in our own countries, and then at a second level, sort of globally speaking. In Central and Western Europe, I think in the beginning there was certainly the discourse on solidarity, this what Ben called social trust, the idea that we all need each other. This was very dominant. I would say dominant also from a top-down level, so very strongly communicated through the government as something that is now the rhetoric, now this is our slogan, our motto, and people subscribe to that. However, what I also realized is that they only subscribe to that for a rather limited period of time. As the lockdown wore on, I think you could tell that, of course, we try to be helpful to each other. We try to act in solidarity, but then when it comes down to it, it's not that easy. And at the same time, one strong emotion that I also see, and this is always a very problematic one when it comes to policy making and politics in general, is the notion of fear, right? And we know that fear can be very problematic because fear can be used and employed very well by political decision makers across the spectrum, really, to instigate sometimes very problematic responses. And again, I wanted to draw a parallel to previous crises that we saw, where fear was very much used as the kind of emotion that helped people come to power, stay in power, but also that provoked certain responses from the electorate, I think. And I do think that it's a very thin line that on the one hand, of course, a certain kind of respect for this situation needs to be instigated, that people need to be aware that this is serious. But a fearful response can also have the reverse effect then. And so what I would say from my field of research, and when it comes to migration, really, where I really miss this notion of solidarity is that I still see very much different social groups. So we do act in solidarity, or we try at least to do so, with our closest neighbors. And now I mean neighbors literally, but also figuratively, with close European neighbors and so on. But if it comes to, and again, bringing in marginalized groups here in society, they are not considered as sort of those who are deserving of our solidarity, I think. And this is sort of not even part of the general picture. And I mentioned Greek islands and refugees being stuck there, and I think it's a good example of how this has been completely out of our mind, really, because this situation goes on. But of course, there is no notion that perhaps when we talk about global solidarity, human solidarity, the international community as a sort of response to a crisis, this would also include children being stuck in Moria, just as an example, right? And I think this is a discourse that has not been, that was not introduced, and now, and this brings me to my conclusion here, this question between social trust or rather social distrust, and is it a competition or is it cooperation, I think will become even more important when we move into the second crisis connected to COVID, which will be an economic crisis. And again, I think different countries will be hit differently by it. Ben already introduced that also in his introductory statement very well, I think. So I do think that Europe has some good measures in place. You mentioned unemployment packages and so on. There are many different measures that are being debated. However, there will also be countries where the response will be more problematic. The US is an example where we can already see or get the notion really that the economic fallout will be traumatic. And what then that means is, of course, this will increase social inequalities in many countries. And then again, I think I rather see very much on the horizon the potential, the danger of having or having increased social friction rather than increased solidarity between different groups because of economic inequalities that might become more highlighted. So it's not necessarily a very optimistic outlook, I'm afraid, that I can offer, but it's something that I think needs to be kept in mind also when we try to make our economic responses as targeted as possible. I think this is important.
Thank you so much, Ben.
Yeah. So in this Reconnect blog that I wrote, indeed, I think in the first lockdown week, because what else could I do? I distinguish those two streams, indeed, the politics of solidarity and the politics of fear. Very much with the idea also of the impact on democracy. You know, I mean that you could see authoritarianism gaining the upper hand because of the crisis, and you could also see that a sense of solidarity could prevail. And well, it's easy, of course, to sketch it like that, to see there are these two competing dynamics, and one may prevail depending on time and depending on place in different ways. So I don't think there's one overarching answer here. It depends. And I have to admit, my own thinking has been going down on this in waves. I think the initial weeks I was quite optimistic because governments responded. You saw indeed that this rally around the flag effect. And then as we went down into April, I became more skeptical. I felt very much, okay, but at some point there's going to be an authoritarian rebound. And people are going to feel like this is taking too long. There are people dying, but at the same time we're losing our freedoms. We want to get our own lives back, and let's have a strong leader. Well, we also have seen that strong leaders have not performed particularly well. And now I'm more optimistic. And of course, I think, well, the future is open, so we also have a duty to be optimistic in a way, to look at what are the potential upsides that we can exploit here. And I have to say, I am getting more optimistic. As I said, that I think that our democratic systems have not failed. And in many respects, democratic systems have responded more adequately, or authoritarian rulers have often done particularly badly. So they cannot claim that they have been very effective in governing their countries. And of course, Trump, Bolsonaro, but even Johnson, of course, are the examples everyone is looking at. So it changed over time, and it changed over place. I mean, how this will play out in the long term, the Polish case, well, I still am optimistic there. That we will see a non-PiS president there taking the reins. Of course, Italy is a very interesting place to watch, but I'm actually struck so far that the current coalition seems to hold up pretty well, and that its critics from the Lega Nord have not been able to exploit the crisis so far. But indeed, a lot there depends on what the rest of Europe is going to do to stabilize the Italian economy. So yes, I think the future is open. I think now we're in a situation where democratic politicians have everything to lose. But if they handle it well, there's a good prospect that we may get out of this in a situation where you have a stronger state, more solidarity, and indeed also more support for the poor. I mean, Julia is talking about that indeed the crisis has hit those at the bottom hardest. But I think there's also a number of measures where we can start. We start at the bottom. We start indeed, and that's why I refer to the Spanish response. If you start with a basic income scheme, you start to rebuild the social pyramid from the bottom up, rather than that you start from saving the banks to draw out the most extreme example or position. So I'm still optimistic, but it's not a done deal. And as I said, I mean, it will play out at different moments, in different places, in different ways.
Everyone watching can't see this, but I can see, let's say, a critical look on Judith's face. So, Judith, do you want to respond?
No, I wasn't even critical.
Or skeptical, maybe.
For the largest part of Ben's speech, I was nodding in consent, absolutely. I was just thinking that when you mentioned maybe we don't have to save the banks, we could just instead introduce basic income. I was thinking in Austria, we are currently saving an airline. So I don't know if that is. But actually, what I wanted to do is to introduce two more, slightly more optimistic thoughts here, inspired by what Ben just said. I do think that in many democratic societies, there has been reached, because of this whole COVID-19 crisis and because of the new role of evidence for policymaking, we've reached, at least in bits and pieces, though not comprehensively, a new culture of discourse, a new culture of political discourse, because everyone at this point had such a high stake in the game. It was our own well-being, right? So people became very much interested in political discourse, very much engaged. And also I feel like for the first time, politicians really meant it when they said we have to base our decisions on evidence, on hard evidence, because really they needed that. I mean, this was a very close evidence, medically speaking, But at least in the beginning, people were really scrambling for facts and trying to get enough studies and data on that. The question is then also issues of transparency. You know, not all countries have been as transparent with, you know, who were the experts that informed them, whom did they talk to, who were in the close council of experts and who were on the margins. This is a problem. But when it comes to being interested in political discourse and talking about what is going on, from the vantage point of Austria, I remember in the first couple of weeks, it was like a vacuum and there was almost no opposition. But then slowly we could see that democratic powers came into place again. So the media stepped up their game, you know, the opposition, the political opposition in parliament stepped up their game. And there was again, I think, a good sort of political discourse being introduced. And this could be something that makes us optimistic in the long run. And then secondly, and again, this brings me to the historical parallels. I mean, historically speaking, we've always seen that crises and the big upheavals of the 20th century, they always gave birth to big and important changes, right? I mean, the EU basically, the whole EU integration project as an idea could be traced back to the Second World War, same to the United Nations and so on. And we've had these sort of developments time and again. And so this could be taken as perhaps an optimistic outlook when we look into history and see what was created and what wasn't. So I'm just adding this because I think my initial statement sounded so bleak. I do see reason for optimism and for a brighter outlook, perhaps. Yes.
Thank you so much. At one point, you could see me sort of having a skeptical face, which mainly had to do with the fact that there were governments, including the Austrian ones, who sort of ramped up the threat level and were
just because of fear.
Yeah, because fear and yeah. I can also sort of see the rationale behind it. Fear was used as a way to make people stay at home, you know. But something that I wanted to, and you've given me, both of you, so many pointers. So there's so much stuff I want to talk about, but let's start with this. To draw also sort of the connection to the broader discussion, previous crisis, etc. There's a big debate in political science on EU crises and the politicization of EU politics. And you know that there are basically two camps when it comes to the politicization. So there's one camp that sees politicization mainly in a term of what Hoche and Marx called the development of a constraining dissensus. So the topic becomes much more salient for citizens, but it becomes mainly salient in terms of growing contestation of the EU and EU integration, which in turn strengthens European Eurosceptic parties, which then again makes it more difficult for member states to come to agreements at the EU level on the necessary policies because they fear electoral backlash at home. That's a sort of a very, very, very short summary of this view. So politicization has a very negative connotation in this view. And there's another view that has long been advocated, for example, by Simon Hicks, which sees politicization as a very welcome development. So it's a welcome development in that the EU finally becomes a topic that is salient for citizens, salient for public discourse, salient for party competition, and finally sort of gets the position in our political lives that it should have. It finally injects the EU with the politics that Brussels so long pretended didn't exist. So I would really like to hear your view, not, you know, if you want to sort of choose a side of those two, but that's, I wanted to ask you, to what extent do you think does the pandemic and the response by the EU. Also the fact that, of course, governments haven't been shy to accuse the EU of not doing enough and then doing too much. How much of a backlash do you think will that have in terms of politicization? And maybe I do want to know whether you think it's a good thing or not. Either I'm whoever wants to go first.
Shall I go first? Yeah, I think a lot of this debate about is politicization good for European cooperation is confused because we often think that it's, well, the question is what is the object? More centralization, more support for really centralizing things at the European center. Then, of course, the more you're in agreement, the easier it is to centralize, if we're all the same. But that would be a natural. Of course, we have conflict. So I think if you look at if the choice is whether we are willing to find modes to settle our disagreements, to recognize that we disagree, that disagreements are natural, but that we at the same time recognize that we have to deal with those disagreements in the context of the interdependencies that we have in Europe, then I think politicization is crucial to democratize Europe. But then it's not about creating some kind of super state. It's about creating ways to agree to disagree. And I think one of the big problems that Europe is facing at the moment is that we don't know that we disagree is natural and it's good. But we now often, when we disagree, well, a number of things happen. One is that we don't do anything, but not doing anything is also a decision. Non-decisions are also decisions. That's a classical political science insight. You let things happen. So indeed, if you disagree or if you fail to do anything on China, well, that's also a decision. You do nothing about China and you just let it happen. Or if you disagree about Syria and you decide not to take a stance on that, then you let it happen, and that's also a stance. Although it's a very empty and regrettable sense. The other thing that we often have is that we disagree and we are unable to get to action, and then actually we let the powers that be rule. And sometimes that's Berlin, or quite often that's Berlin. So you don't have procedures, you just have power. So you impose a very demanding loan on a country because you can, and you do that outside of the treaty framework. Or indeed you have powerful lobbyists who are able to manipulate the market for data technology in the way that they like it. So what Europe should be about, and what I think politicization can help, is to instill upon us that we have to find procedures where we can channel our disagreements, and where we can find ways to say that instead of having situations where you let non-decisions govern you, or where you have just the powers that be govern you, we can appropriate the decision and have decision rules where we trust each other enough to settle disagreements between ourselves. And that's what we do to some extent, of course. We do that effectively in the single market domain. It's a very small domain. And a lot of the big issues that are now, well, before us, but also already behind us, because that have governed the last 5-10 years, are domains that we don't have covered very well by good decision procedures. So we don't know how to deal with asylum. We simply don't know. So the question just evaporates. We don't know how to deal with foreign and security matters and the global politics in Europe. So the thing just evaporates. We don't know how to save countries financially. So we just settle it by kind of ad hoc means and outside of the treaty. So one, I think the big issue that this situation brings back is that we have to expand our realm of agreed procedures, where we say, well, how do we trust each other enough? Where do we trust each other enough to find common procedures? And that's, I think, where also the debate about the future of Europe, and where we now have a conference coming in, often gets off the road, because the idea is now, yeah, it should address policies. So maybe the conference should discuss about what do we have to do about health. And then the expectation is that somehow, if you put a lot of citizens together in a room and you let them discuss, they will all agree that a coordinated European health policy will be a good idea and that we need more competence in health. Well, it doesn't work that way. People will disagree about it, and for good reasons. People will have different interests in whether they want to centralize health and all that. So, of course, the governments don't want it to be a constitutional conference, but that's just what I'm talking about. I think we have to explore each other's differences and then look each other in the eye and say, well, if we're different and we are different and we have different interests and competing interests and conflicting interests, how do we want to deal with them in a peaceful and powerless, but deliberate, collective way, democratic way? How do we settle our disagreements, and what are good procedures to settle them? And that's the question that Europe is now looking away from. If you read the position of the Council of Ministers of last week, it's very much like, let's not do constitutional issues. Let's talk substance. Let's turn all these citizens that we consult into technocrats and let them advise us about what competences we need in Europe or what kind of policies we need. But citizens are not going to decide for politicians what kind of policies they need. But they can build trust between each other and say, well, this is where I trust to work together with the Finns and the Greek and the Romanians. And this is where I really don't want them to be involved at all. And I want to keep my national policies and I want to keep national diversity. But we have to put that on the table rather than improvise and decide on the spot how we're going to handle it and leave it to coincidences, powers, and indeed external factors to decide for us.
Thank you so much. Judith, do you immediately want to come in?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Ben. I think this was a very dense response. I see it in a very similar way in the sense that you really actually can't simply do nothing, because the moment you do nothing, it's also doing something, right? Because disagreement basically means stalling, and then you have this whole backlog of issues that are just keep on being unresolved. You mentioned asylum, which is, of course, I think a key issue here, and now moving into Germany's presidency of the EU Council, we'll see how that will play out, because again, it's on everybody's agenda there. But I have to say I'm not too optimistic that a wholesale, I don't know, Dublin reform will be achieved. What I found interesting during the pandemic is it highlighted the potential for what is essentially already an old idea, I think, namely that it's not necessarily an EU of nations, but more an EU of regions in an ideal case that would make sense. Let me elaborate on that, because what we saw in the pandemic was that it really didn't make sense to say that the whole of Italy is terribly affected. It were certain regions that were worse off than other Italian regions. So what really didn't really make sense, also from a logical perspective, was to say, you know, the whole of Italy should be banned and there will be travel bans to the whole of Italy, for instance, or I don't know, aid should be directed to the whole nation, but rather it was very much regional clusters of infection, for instance. At the same time, however, what we did see at the very beginning of the pandemic was what I would call parallel to social distancing, kind of a national distancing, right? So every country had their own response. And I think, Ben, in your introductory statement, you pointed out very well that still people learn from, countries learn from each other. So there is this sort of networked approach that was going on. I think in the very beginning of the lockdown, that wasn't so evident, that we were indeed learning from each other. You know, it was very much a single issue, our nation, and focusing very much on this nationalistic, even nativistic approach. But then later on, I think this idea of the regions emerged much stronger. And this is, of course, an idea that we've been playing back and forth in how far the EU could actually also help to strengthen regions, and then also strengthen, for instance, national minorities in certain countries living regionally. And so a response here, I think, could also be that the moment it's not that the nation as such has an agreement, but rather that on a regional level, we try to come to an agreement, or let me put it that way, that the consensus that should be achieved is not necessarily a consensus achieved by individual nation states, but that it could even be dissenting opinions and points of view within that nation states, because we grant more power and individual rights perhaps to certain regions. I think there's the potential for that, which opens up a whole new debate, of course, but one that is much older than the pandemic, in my opinion. On the other hand, I think I really agree with Ben's point on the fact that there needs to be certain measures in place on how do we go from basic disagreement. How can we achieve a EU that doesn't stop there, to register a disagreement on a certain issue, and then it really has no way forward from there because there are no real procedures in place. And I think this just perhaps the pandemic could be could provide some impetus here. That this situation should be resolved in the longer perspective.
Thank you so much. Can I follow up on that? And I would like to focus a bit on the convention for the future of Europe. As Ben said, and
we are not allowed to talk about the convention. It's a conference.
The conference. Yes, the conference. Yes, the council. The council made that very, very clear. You are absolutely right, and I apologize. The conference on the future of Europe, which has nothing to do with any kind of treaty change and is not intended to change the treaty, as the council has just very, very disappointingly told us all. And I'm disappointed and a bit angry that institutional questions seem to have been just taken off the agenda. And I'll come back to you, Ben, to talk a bit about that. I want to ask, because, you know, let's stay with policies and let's assume that we may want to talk about other policies than just health policy at this conference, especially as it is supposed to last for 2 years and be based on a massive involvement of the European citizens. So let me ask you, Judith. According to the Commission President von der Leyen, but also according to the views of the European Parliament, there shouldn't be a lot of issues off the agenda for this convention. It's supposed to be a very, very open discussion, a listening exercise, maybe, hopefully, this time even be a hearing exercise and not just a listening one. Now, one of the topics, and we can see that again now, and you've addressed this with regard to the crisis, one of the most divisive issues in the last years in Europe, and one of the main reasons for growing nationalism, populism, and Euroscepticism is, of course, migration. So should we discuss migration at a conference among citizens, and what's the danger?
Well, I'm biased here, of course, so I would say yes. I think the question is, what are the circumstances and the parameters for discussing it, and with what goal in mind? Problem that I see is that in the past, when we've discussed migration policy, what we actually meant was security policy on an EU level very much. So migration policy in the EU is very much externalization of migration policy to third countries, really, who do, and I put it like that deliberately, who do the migration management for us. And then this also in many, many cases, not all the cases, but in many cases, whether we look at the Balkans, whether we look at the Turkish-Greek border, whether we look at Libya, even worse, involves a violation of human rights, involves violence and so on. And this is where the EU not only bats a blind eye, but really even condones it by, for instance, I would say by legitimizing it, for instance, by supporting the Balkans and supporting and being continuously in talks about potential, countries joining the EU. So this is also a way of condoning it. And of course, the whole EU-Turkey deal was a way of condoning some of these, as we know, violent measures here. So I'm not sure whether the Conference on the Future of Europe actually has the potential of introducing a completely new discourse on migration, because I think that would be needed to actually talk about it honestly. Move it away from a mere security issue, and currently it is nothing else but a security issue, to actually addressing it, what it means, also connecting it to other challenges. And I think that's so important, and that's really also, I think, what our discussion today is really about, to how can we address several crises that are happening. We haven't even touched upon the climate crisis yet, but of course that's a big one on the horizon, and there are many others as well. how can we connect them and ideally find synergies and find ways of addressing the one by also addressing the other. Now in Europe, that might mean addressing an aging population, addressing problems with healthcare. And when we talk about healthcare, we talk very much about migrant workers doing healthcare for the elderly, for instance. So there is an obvious connection here. But also when we talk about the climate crisis, we will have to address the effect that many more people will be on the move in decades to come because their home countries become inhabitable. So all of this is really connected, and what I would really hope is that if we do address migration or any other issue, it is always embedded in a very, very comprehensive picture. Now, I think that's a very, very loaded wish, you know, and I'm asking for a lot here, I'm aware. But I think our main chance lies in connecting the dots and rather than keeping addressing single issues, which in the past really has been problematic. So I would say yes, but unfortunately, especially the topic of migration, you said it correctly, has been so divisive, and we would need a completely new playing field, really, from the bottom up. It can be done, but I see many dangers with that, but because of course what you do not want to have is to start with such a divisive issue, or to then also have certain member states for whom any discussion of that is just off the table. And then that leads into a sort of a more negative direction here. So yeah, I'm afraid I don't really have the clear-cut answer on that, but I would say that ideally we managed to have, maybe borrowing Ben's words, a networked response. Maybe that's also something. And I do just one final word. I mean, I do see some valuable points in what Germany now suggested when it's taking the council presidency, that, you know, solidarity in terms of migration policy can, for instance, mean that some people host refugees, but others would contribute in other ways. And now we have to talk about what these other ways can be. So this can be differentiated, targeted and very specific approach to the topic, and not a one-size-fits-all solution for all the member states.
Now, I'm sorry if I get sort of, I'll be pressing you a bit more on this, because finding an agreement amongst the member states, and as you said, sort of finding a different approach, a different discourse is difficult, and maybe one shouldn't overburden the conference with such a divisive issue. On the other hand, the conference is supposed to have a very large component of citizen and civil society participation. And do you think that would actually be an opportunity to address this issue, to have it discussed at this level where citizens can talk to each other about their frustrations? I mean, look at the situation in the Mediterranean where much of the frustration comes from the feeling of being completely left alone with the problem, and have a dialogue at the citizen, a public dialogue, obviously, but a dialogue at the citizen and civil society level on each other's concerns, fears surrounding this topic. Do you think? I mean, is that just a pipe dream, or is that actually something that might have an impact?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think we saw that in 2015 that an impact was possible, yes. And also I would introduce one more sort of player in this game. It's not only civil society and citizens as such, but it's very much the cities, individual cities, that have been very strong in their response to saying, we are aware that the country that we are situated in is not interested in, for instance, hosting refugees or making a valuable response to that. But, you know, we would like to host 10, 15, 20, you name it. And Germany is a good example of that, where we had this League of the Secure Ports, as they called themselves, sichere Hafen. And this was an initiative that really sparked off, and I think also built up some pressure, because we know very well that Seehofer's response to hosting refugee children, for instance, was very different in the past, and it has now slightly changed. And I think this is also due to the pressure that has been built up by civil society, by the cities. And again, this brings me back to the importance of regions rather than the nation state. So I do see a lot of potential there. maybe I don't want to be too optimistic in order not to take too much away, you know, don't go into that with too many expectations. But yes, ideally it is a combination of bottom-up pressure that is being built, bottom-up best practices, even bottom-up good examples, but also then at some point I think we need a coordinated top-down approach. I think that should still be on the agenda. It can't be that the EU says, you know what, this whole migration thing, maybe you deal with that on your own, you know, and maybe we just take our hands off there. I don't think that that should be the goal, and I do see that danger as well, of course, at some point. So I think it has to be a very good sort of negotiation that's going on between these two poles, even at the conference.
Thank you so much. Ben, looking sort of also back to crises in the past, there seems to be just a string of crises. I mean, it's no wonder that former Commission President Juncker called it a polycrisis. We seem to stumble from one into the next. There's a saying, I don't know whether it's an old saying, but it is one, that sort of crises are also times of crisis are also times of innovation. Would you agree? Would you agree that's true for the EU level? Looking back, I know you've worked a lot on the Eurozone crisis as well. And would you say it is also, or maybe, I don't know, what is it a time of innovation, and is it a time of democratic innovation?
Ooh, I guess the saying is very much never waste a good crisis. But I'm not sure whether, and that was, what is it, Emmanuel, no? The chief of staff of Obama. I'm not sure whether Europe is in a very good position to exploit the potential of the positive potential of a crisis. And we have to be honest, crises are also are tipping points. They may go either way. So indeed, they may indeed harbor the potential for progressive change, but they may just as well harbor the potential for regressive change. I mean, you can also say that, say, the Second World War was a result of crisis, and that's not where we want to end up. So I think you have to lay the groundwork. If you want to move forward and use the crisis in a positive way, then I think we first have to have our house in order. That means we can also only build, for instance, a better Europe if we have strong member states and well-functioning member states. If we have weak member states or member states where democracy is being exploited or going down the drain, then it infects the whole house. So we have to work from the bottom up in this respect. And the other thing is also, I think, if you want to have an open conversation on the future of Europe and the potential that we have, then you have to make sure that some countries are not in a very vulnerable and dependent position. So in that sense, I'm not sure whether we can have the political conversation before we have settled some basic economic issues. If a country like Greece or Italy is kind of really hanging on a lifeline, then you cannot have an open democratic conversation about voting rights and basic political fundamentals. I mean, you need to have some sense of basic security, both in your political national house as well as in the economic conditions that you have. So in that sense, I think this is a very daunting moment to open up the box. And I'm inclined to say that the timing is a bit unfortunate. Now, there hasn't been a good time over the last 5-6 years, or ever since 2009, last decade, to say, well, this is a good time to discuss the future of Europe. I mean, there's always a crisis on the horizon. But I would say that the priority should be for member states to get their house in order, for economics to get back in line again. And it's a bit unfortunate. Why are we now having this conversation? Why is this conference on the future of Europe on the agenda? Well, there's two things. One is, of course, that Macron has been pushing this ever since he was elected as president of France. He didn't see the coronavirus crisis coming. And the other thing is that we had these leftovers, that the election of the Commission president did not work out in a very satisfying way. In 2019, last year, there was an idea that the European Parliament could kind of claim its power to say, well, the outcome of the European Parliament elections will determine the potential candidates for the Commission President. Well, the biggest party group, the EPP, had a candidate, Manfred Weber, and he didn't become Commission President. So something went wrong, at least in the eyes of some actors. And it was clear for all actors involved that we needed a better construction about how we're going to move from European Parliament elections to the nomination of the President of the European Commission. And this blew up into something these two things that Macron has been advocating, this idea of having a wider debate on the future of Europe, and indeed these institutional loose ends. They came together and say, well, maybe this is where we have to have a proper conference. And indeed, I mean, in December, January, everyone was the Parliament and the Commission were very busy on preparing their ideas on that, and then the Corona crisis hit. I'm very skeptical at this moment. I think whatever promise the conference may have is bound to disappoint. And indeed, there are many actors who are already trying to sideline the conference. And then again, you have another exercise in so-called citizen participation, while in the end you don't live up to the promises made or the idea that they will decide anything. So I was already skeptical about the proposals of the Commission and the European Parliament, and the position of the Council certainly hasn't helped. So I'm a bit, maybe I would be expecting too much, and maybe I'm too sentimental about the good old convention mode of engaging citizens, but also for politicians to really have an open debate. But at this point, I would say that maybe, to be honest, our priorities should not be in having another conference and on having all kinds of debates. Maybe first we have the member states to look inward, and indeed to make sure that the country where basically democracy has been abolished, and that's Hungary. I mean, Orban will not leave unless people force him to, but there are no free elections in Hungary anymore, that we really make sure that democracy is again working in all 28 countries before we try to move it up to the European level. Can't make it more positive than that.
It's very nice how you are very diplomatic, sort of in your description of what happened after the 2019 election, which was basically the almost casual abandonment of something that was hailed as a democratic innovation. Hailed. One can be, one can think of the Spitzenkandidaten process, what one wants. But to first advertise it and then to casually abandon it for political and personal reasons, you are very, very diplomatic about this.
Can I qualify that a bit? I mean, of course, the European Parliament, I think here again has overpromised and said, well, this is great for European democracy, vote for us and we give you a Commission President. But I think that really misunderstands and misconstructs what's going on in Europe. I mean, what we have is indeed a network Europe, not a superstate Europe. If we would have a superstate Europe, with the European Parliament being our collective parliament and centralizing all democratic force at one place, then it would be in the position to say, okay, it's up to us to have the main hand in deciding who gets to lead the Commission. But what we have is indeed a Europe where member states are still very strong, are the main communicative centers. We saw it in the crisis again. Who do we look at our national leaders? They have communicative force. More than regions, more than European level, it's in the end the authority at national level that brings us together and that provides direction. And I think Europe is built on its member states and on its citizens. And the nice thing is that the way that in the treaty now also the election of the Commission President is organized, it recognizes that. It makes it a kind of ping-pong game. It says, well, okay, first you have the European Parliament elections, but then it goes back to the member states and they have a say, and they have to find a kind of agreement between each other. There has to be a bridge or balance between what the member states think about who's best to lead the European Commission and what the European Parliament, representing the people directly, thinks is the best idea. But they have to communicate between the two. And the European Parliament basically pushed its luck and said, no, we can do without the member states. We control it. That was, again, a false democratic promise. And it also misrepresented what Europe is about, because we cannot have a strong Europe without strong member states. And if you want to kind of sideline those and say, well, the member states shouldn't be involved in this, we can govern this by the European Parliament, I think you overestimate what the European Parliament does. We have strong national democracies and we have a strong European democracy, and we have to find a way to make that work together. So in that sense, I really think actually that here the members of the European Parliament were wrong, and some of the critics and opponents among the member states were actually right to say, well, this is not how it's going to work. And then, of course, the European Parliament was really unlucky that its biggest group came forward with a candidate who didn't bring a lot of political capital, and actually was compromised because he's really very soft on the most anti-democratic force in Europe that we have. So I don't have to be diplomatic about that. Manfred Weber has compromised himself with keeping Fidesz in the EPP.
Thank you. If these were calmer times, given how you just described the EU, and of course the sort of the counterpoint to the Commission President would then also be the Council President. What would be democratic reforms that, in your view, the EU should tackle? What should we discuss at a convention if we were sort of crisis-free and could be all calm and collected about it?
Well, there's the longer run and the shorter run, I guess. I mean, first we have to think about how we're going to organize the election of the Commission President and the leadership of Europe in 4 years' time at the next European Parliament elections, and that needs to be solved. And I think you have to think about how you organize the balance between member states and the European Parliament. So you need one proposal has been to reverse the process. So now actually it's the member states nominate and the European Parliament then gets the final vote. And maybe the European Parliament, having been elected, should nominate, and then they know that they still have to pass the vote in the member states, so they have to anticipate and consult the member states before they push any kind of figure. And I would actually I think there are alternative proposals that you should discuss in the convention. One is a shared search committee. So you could have a mixed committee where representatives of the member states and representatives of the parliament meet together and say, let's search for the best candidate, given a number of criteria that we have decided on the basis of the outcome of the European Parliament election. So I think the idea that it's the kind of direct translation of the European Parliament election into the President of the Commission is not a good idea. You need some mediation, but you could use the outcome of the elections to draw up a set of criteria and to interpret publicly how do we read those elections, and what does it say about the kind of president that we need for the European Commission. So that's, I think, so you need a kind of what we call conciliation procedure in legislation in Europe. You need some balance between member states and directly elected parliamentarians. What we should discuss in the long run is, of course, two things that I've been very keen to, at least to have as a kind of horizon orientation. One is indeed that you can merge the two positions. So we have now a European Council President, we have a Commission President. There's nothing in treaties that forbids the European Council President to be the Commission President, to fuse the two positions. That has been deliberately kept open. No one wants that. Member states are very afraid of that because they fear that there would be too strong a figure. But I think that would be good for the coherence and for the presentation of Europe. As I said, you want to present this distinction between or this opposition between Parliament and the member states. And the way to do so is not to have a parliamentary elected council president in the long run, but you might want to have something like, I hesitate to say it, an American-style primary process where you in the end up with a directly elected president for Europe. That would create some kind of checks and balances, because it would not be necessarily so that the directly elected European Council President on some kind of elected college model would be one-on-one with the majority in the European Parliament. That person would be relatively independent, could listen to the member states, could listen to the Parliament, but it would transcend those two pillars, and that's important, I think. The Commission President should not be a servant or an agent of the member states, But it should not be a servant or an agent of the parliament either. It should be a third figure that can mediate between them and sometimes transcend them and say, well, these are the interests of the member states, these are the interests of the people of Europe, and I want to go beyond it and collect it in a general, transcendent European interest. So in that sense, the long term, but I'm not sure that that's something for a conference or a convention in the next 2 years, but something maybe in the longer run could be a directly elected European Union president that is both president of the Commission as well as the European Council.
Thank you so much. That's actually a topic we could probably talk about for the next 2 hours. But I want to give Judith the opportunity to respond to that as well.
Thank you. I would actually like to pick up a point that you mentioned at the beginning of your last statement, this notion of innovation, right? And whether this is now a time for innovation, how can innovation come about and what is needed? And generally speaking, because I'm not a political scientist, so I feel very hesitant to actually offer my opinion on EU institutions here. But what I do see now, and I'm not sure whether this was the case in previous crises as well, but now it's kind of is very apparent to me, is that it's not like a sudden kind of change that we see, or not even a sudden kind of innovational climate that we are surrounded with in different levels of life. So talking about policy and politics, but also economics, or, you know, this people talk about digitalization of the home office and so on, and innovation in the private sector. I think what we are rather seeing is changes that have already been instigated before that were already on their way before the crisis hit. They are now gaining momentum, and they gain tempo, and they might be implemented faster in a way, because this whole digitalization talk, as a very prominent example, is not new, right? But then all of a sudden, I mean, we had more or less all the technologies in place, and I don't think the talking about the tool that we're using now to talk to each other, this already existed before the crisis, and you know, there might be some new popping up now, but essentially it's just a development rather than a very sudden kind of innovation. And I say that because in the beginning of the crisis, especially economists were very quick to point out Schumpeter's idea of creative destruction, right? So that you first have to create, destroy the old and then create the new and so on. And it's like a radical change idea in a way. Like there is one sort of caesura, really, a very clear moment of crisis or of change, and then nothing is the way it was before. And I'm not actually sure that this is true for many sectors and areas of life now. And I'm not sure about policy either, and about political institutions, for instance, whether it's not more like a kind of, if we do see a change, it is in many cases a change that was already slowly going on, slowly sort of presenting itself before the crisis. And now it's just gaining momentum. And I think that might be true in many areas of life. And so maybe, because Ben also said there's never best moment to have this conference, right? Because we are in this perpetual crisis mode. And I think, yeah, that's true, probably. That's very true. And so I think that perhaps even when we look back at this point in time in 20 years or so, maybe we see that it wasn't even a moment for these big changes, but things that maybe things slowly just presented themselves and were revealed that we already know. And I talked about structural inequalities at the beginning. This is very true, I think. So perhaps what we can hope for is a slow evolution rather than complete revolution. Perhaps that's a more sort of optimistic outlook here. I'm not sure, and I'm very hedging a lot, as you can see. Yeah, and as concerns the conference, I might be a bit more optimistic than Ben here, but I agree that especially when it's about these very big events here, it's good to keep your expectations as low as possible. I think we've been disappointed a lot in the past, so I give you that, yes.
Thank you. I think this is a very sort of optimistic, carefully optimistic, but lovely moment to sort of end this discussion on, because unfortunately we have to end it a bit early because Ben will have to leave us for a very important event. Can I maybe just, if you have 2 more minutes, sort of draw the discussion back to the whole topic of the symposium, and just in case it hasn't become completely clear, sort of in the course of this symposium, but also in the course of your contributions today, sort of come back to the question raised by you, Judith. Sort of, how does the pandemic show what the social sciences can contribute? And if you want to comment, maybe, I don't know, 2-3 minutes, Ben, if you have the time.
I think there's 2 ways to look at it. I think I'm going to take a bit of distance from the hardcore scientific suggestion that this crisis has really revealed how dependent we are on good science, because I think it also has shown the limits of science, how deeply uncertain we are, and how little we know, and how difficult it is for scientists to measure. Well, even the presence of a virus, let alone successful approaches. We don't know what is a successful strategy, and we only know in the long run what strategy has been successful. So in that sense, I think it also shows that as scientists, we should not promise hard solutions and hard truths, because even if you have facts and figures, they remain contestable, and in the end, the political decisions still need to be made, and they are not, unfortunately, not dictated by the facts alone. We need to make tragic decisions between, indeed, constraining freedom and increasing health risk. And those are very difficult decisions that the facts and the truths will not make for us, but play the ball directly back at collective responsibility. I would argue that what here the social sciences should not only should claim its own distinctive role. They should not claim to be able to match the hard sciences, the natural sciences, in providing facts and compelling knowledge, but rather that our role is above all, I think a lot about what we've just been doing, to point out alternatives, to point out choices, to point out alternative scenarios. To use, indeed, to help spreading the knowledge of and the experience of other countries, to show, hey, you can learn from them, you can learn from that. We as scientists, I think, play a preeminent role in communicating experiences between different countries. And I'm very happy, for instance, now to talk to Austrian scholars, because I think that's where we learn from each other. And that's where the social sciences have to contribute. In that sense, rather than to try to close certain debates on one truth and one evidence, that only this approach will get us to R is 0, for instance. That suggestion, I'm not sure that that's the role of science, but certainly not the role of social sciences. I think the role of social science is rather to expand the scope of alternatives. So these are the choices that we have. These are the alternatives, and these are possible implications of the different scenarios that we have. And to open the debate about that, and to make very deliberate choices possible, rather than to force them by some kind of quasi-religious scientific authority, like we have the solution for you at hand. No, we don't have the solution, but we have many answers. And in that sense, by providing many answers, we can provide choices and alternatives and help people to make up their minds, and to make up their minds in a responsible way.
Very good point about the sort of the importance of making sure that there are no truths based on facts when it comes to politics. There are different interpretations of the facts, different selections of facts, and decisions that are based on both. Judith?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I absolutely agree, I have to say. I think that COVID really revealed how insecure, how preliminary, and also how messy science is, per se, and has always been. I mean, we are aware of that, right? And this is true for the natural sciences as much as is it true for the social sciences. There are many stops and starts. It's trial and error, and it's always preliminary. There is no final knowledge, really. And also, I think very importantly, I mean, you mentioned that, Katrin, there are no truths, and especially facts are not neutral, data is not neutral. It's always very important what you make of it, how you interpret it. It's always in a social context, in a historical and cultural context. And I do think, like, to me, that was made crystal clear during COVID. I don't know if that's the conclusion that everyone draws from it, but certainly people, and I think this is where citizens became hesitant, were many for the first time in their lives confronted with the basic and essential insecurity that science produces, especially when it ventures into completely new fields. And so it revealed a lot of the process of how science or facts are made. You know, the German Wissenschaft is about Wissen schaffen, to make knowledge. Knowledge is being made, and I think we saw that in action, which is beautiful, I think. And then also when it comes to the contribution of the social sciences, I think that the role of the humanities and the social sciences really should be to critique, to explain, to offer this meta perspective, you know, to contextualize, to also discuss and perhaps point out blind spots, point out issues that might be not at the top of the natural scientists' agenda, to contextualize, to point out discrepancies, to put into context, and also to link, again, going back to the poly crisis and so on. And really, I think that now we're slowly moving into a phase where we can see that social sciences do have a lot to offer in handling this crisis. Because now it's very much about, yes, there are the medical things, the medical reasons, you know, health is important, but also there's the other issue of, you know, social measures, and how does a society respond to that? How much can a society bear? How much can humans bear? And it's a very delicate balance. But in order to navigate that balance, I do think that you need the social sciences and the humanities. And to just have the natural sciences would be terribly amiss, really. And I think the same will be true for the climate crisis, if I can just add that. Because again, we see sort of the natural scientists, of course, dominating the discourse, but really we also need to know, what does it mean? And the meaning, the significance of that, of it, this is something that only the humanities and the social sciences can offer to it, yeah.
I think you just provided the absolute best statement to end this on. As much as I would like to be honest, I would like to get comfy and discuss this for a while, because I'm really enjoying myself. Alas, we cannot, we have to end it here. So thank you to everyone watching us, but especially a huge big thank you to both of you for joining us today and for sharing your thoughts. I think it was a really interesting conversation. Thank you so much. And can you stay in the chat for just a second after we go offline? Thank you so much.